The wolf was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing Wren thought when she rounded the corner of the lower courtyard and found it standing in the middle of the path, enormous and utterly still, blocking the only route to the well. It was the size of a destrier. Its fur was the colour of ash and old iron, each strand tipped with silver, as if the frost had taken permanent residence there. Its eyes were pale as winter sky, burning with something that was not hunger and not rage, but a third thing she had no word for. Steam rose from its muzzle in the cold morning air. Behind it, 3 of the castle's senior she-wolves stood pressed against the far wall with their backs flat to the stone, their faces white, not moving. They were ranked women with titles and standing and mates who sat on the king's council. They were not moving, and the wolf had not looked at them once. It was looking at Wren. She was carrying an empty water bucket in each hand. Her cloak was the wrong size, a cast-off from the linen stores, patched at both elbows. She had ink on her left wrist from the record-keeping she'd done before dawn, because the record-keeper's assistant was ill, and no one else in the castle would lower themselves to copy grain tallies. Her boots had a split seam along the left heel that let the cold in. She was, by every measurable standard of the Halvard court, no one. She stopped walking. She did not run. Running from a predator was an instinct she had trained herself out of years ago, not because she was brave, but because she had learned early that showing fear only made things worse. She set the buckets down slowly, and the metal ringing soft against the cobblestone. She straightened. She looked at the wolf directly. It was the first mistake she'd made in weeks. You did not hold eye contact with the Alpha King's beast. The court knew this. The guards knew this. The 3 ranked she-wolves currently flattened against the wall definitely knew this. Direct eye contact was a challenge, and the wolf had not tolerated a challenge in the 3 years since the king had brought it back from the northern campaign, changed and terrible, and carrying something inside it that no one could name. Wren held its gaze anyway, not as a challenge. She simply didn't look away. The wolf's ears, which had been pinned flat, shifted. One came forward, then the other. Its massive head tilted to the side. A fraction, barely anything. The way a creature tilts when it hears a sound it is trying to place. It took 1 step toward her. The 3 she-wolves made a sound collectively, a breath of pure terror. The wolf ignored them entirely. It took another step, and another, until it was close enough that Wren could feel the heat radiating off its enormous body, could smell the cold stone and pine resin, and something underneath that was older than both. She did not move. The wolf lowered its head. It brought its muzzle to within inches of her empty open hands. She had turned them up without thinking, a reflex left over from her childhood in the village, from the dogs her grandmother kept, and it exhaled. A single long breath of hot air across her palms. Then it stepped to the side and walked past her and was gone. And the sound of the ranked she-wolves breathing again was audible from across the courtyard. Wren picked up her buckets and went to the well. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She was an Omega in a court that viewed Omegas as furniture, necessary for certain tasks, invisible the rest of the time. She slept in the lower servants' quarters, on a pallet she shared with 2 other women. She ate in the second sitting, after the castle's ranked members had finished. She had been at Halvard's court for 8 months, transferred from her home village as part of the seasonal labour allocation, and in 8 months not one person had learned her name who hadn't needed something from her. She was used to it. It was not bitterness, exactly. It was just the shape of her life. She was good at her work. She had a particular skill with numbers, and with the keeping of records, a habit she'd picked up from the village elder who had let her sit in on the winter accounting because he was half blind and needed someone to read the columns aloud. She kept her head down. She did her tasks. She was useful and invisible, and that was, she had decided, enough. She thought about the wolf that night on her pallet, listening to the other women breathe. It had not looked at the ranked she-wolves at all. 3 women with titles and fur-lined cloaks and status that Wren could not even accurately calculate, and the wolf had looked through them as if they were the ones made of air. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She went to the well the same way the next morning. The wolf was there again. This time it was sitting at the mouth of the courtyard path, patient as a stone, as if it had been waiting. Wren stopped. She looked at it. It looked at her. She picked up her pace, walked past it with 2 feet of clearance, and felt it fall into step behind her. It followed her to the well. It sat while she lowered the bucket and drew the water. It walked back with her to the kitchen entrance. Then it left. The head cook, Myrta, saw the last 30 seconds of this. She did not speak to Wren for the rest of the morning. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has witnessed something she would prefer not to have witnessed, because it complicates her understanding of the order of things. It happened the 3rd morning, and the 4th. By the 5th, the castle had noticed, and noticing a castle meant gossip, and gossip in a court like Halvard's moved like fire in dry thatch. She heard the first version of the story from 2 ranked women outside the great hall. They called her a witch. They said she had used some low charm on the beast, some omega trick, some forbidden thing learned in villages where the old ways were still practiced. The story got worse as it travelled. By the end of the first week, the version circulating in the upper hall had her feeding the wolf blood from her own wrist, and the wolf sleeping across her threshold at night. None of it was true. The wolf had never come inside. It walked with her to the well and back. That was all. But the version Wren could not dismiss, the one that lodged between her ribs and stayed, meant was this, that the Alpha King's wolf had not walked willingly beside any living person in 300 years, that the handlers who cared for it worked behind barriers and threw long iron hooks, that it had broken a man's arm 6 months ago, not in rage, but in what the castle physician had quietly described as confusion, as if the animal had simply forgotten that the body it inhabited was capable of causing harm, that it was not a wolf in any normal sense, but the king's other self, the hidden, unhoused part of him that the northern campaign had cracked open and left exposed to the cold. This information reached Wren on the 7th morning, from the only person in the castle who ever spoke to her directly about anything that mattered, old Bren, the castle archivist, he who was 81 years old and too far past caring about hierarchy to bother maintaining it. "You understand what this means," Bren said, not looking up from the parchment he was sorting. "I understand that it makes people uncomfortable," Wren said. "It makes people terrified," Bren said, "which in a court like this one amounts to the same thing." He finally looked up. His eyes were still sharp. "The wolf has not chosen a companion since the last Alpha Queen. That was 312 years ago. The court will try to make use of you, or they will try to remove you. Either way, child, you are no longer invisible." She left the archive and stood in the corridor for a long moment with her hand flat against the cold stone wall. She had been invisible for 23 years. She had made a careful and complete peace with it. She did not know what to do with being seen. The Alpha King himself, Halvard, whose name the court spoke with the careful deference of people who have learned that certain words carry weight, had not summoned her. He had not acknowledged the reports about the wolf. He had not done anything at all, as far as Wren could determine, except continue to move through his castle like a storm that had learned to walk on 2 legs, contained, deliberate, and making every room feel smaller by his presence in it. She had seen him at a distance 3 times, tall, with the kind of build that suggested generations of warfare distilled into a single body. His hair was dark, cut short, and he had a scar that ran from his left jaw to the corner of his mouth, pale and old, earned before Wren had been born. His eyes were the same color as his wolf's, and she had not known that was possible. He did not look at omegas, not from cruelty, from the same reason that a man standing on a cliff does not look at the individual stones beneath him. It was not malice, it was scale. On the 9th day, they tried to end it. The order came from Lady Sephra, the highest-ranked she-wolf in the castle's permanent household, mate to one of the council's senior lords. Sephra was a composed woman of considerable intelligence and an equally considerable investment in the existing social structure. She had Wren brought to the upper corridor outside the great hall in the late afternoon, when the light was good and the passage was populated. Populated meaning witnessed. She wanted what she was about to do to have an audience. Wren arrived not knowing why she'd been summoned, when she had been told it was a record-keeping matter. She arrived with her ledger tucked under her arm, and found Sephra waiting with 2 other ranked she-wolves and the castle steward, a narrow man named Torvald, who never looked comfortable. "You will take a different route to the well from tomorrow," Sephra said. She did not raise her voice. She had the kind of authority that did not need to. The north courtyard path is a passage used by the castle's senior members. It is not appropriate for servants to use it as a thoroughfare. It was not about the path. Everyone in that corridor knew it was not about the path. "Of course, my lady," Wren said. She kept her voice even. She had practice at this. "I'll use the south passage." "You will also cease whatever it is you are doing with the king's wolf," Sephra said, and her voice had dropped a quarter note into the register she probably used for dismissals. "The animal is a matter of court concern, not a village curiosity. Your continued interference with it is noted and unwelcome." The 2 ranked she-wolves at her side were watching Wren the way people watch a thing they are waiting to see break. "I haven't interfered with it," Wren said. "It followed me. I didn't ask it to." Sephra's composure did not shift visibly, but something behind her eyes moved. "Then you will find a way to discourage it." "I don't know how," Wren said simply. What happened next was not in Sephra's plan for the afternoon. Wren felt it before she heard it, that heat, that smell of pine and old cold stone. And then the wolf was there, at the end of the corridor, having arrived from the direction of the great hall by a route that should not have been passable without someone seeing it enter. It was simply there. It moved down the corridor at a slow, unhurried pace, its head below its shoulders, its eyes fixed on Wren with an attention that made the air in the passage feel pressurized. It walked past Sephra without looking at her, past the 2 ranked she-wolves, past Torvald, who stepped back so quickly he hit the wall. It walked directly to Wren and pressed the side of its enormous head against her shoulder. She put her hand on it, not thinking. Her fingers sank into the thick iron-grey fur. The corridor was utterly silent. Then she heard, from somewhere behind her, footsteps. Not the wolf's padded, soundless movement. Boots, deliberate, measured, and the kind of step that had been doing that for centuries. She turned. Halvard stood at the far end of the corridor. He had come from the direction of his war chamber. She could tell by the map still rolled under one arm. His silver-grey eyes moved from the wolf to her hand resting on its head, to her face. She could not read his expression. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was something much harder to name. The look of a man seeing something he had stopped believing was possible. He said nothing. He looked at Sephra, then back at Wren. Then he walked away. The wolf stayed at her side for another minute. Then it left the way it had come. Sephra said nothing more. The audience Wren hadn't asked for had observed the whole thing. The summons came the following morning, not from Sephra, from the king himself. She was brought to the private study off the war chamber, a room that smelled of old parchment and tallow candles, and the particular cold that the king seemed to generate, regardless of how many fires were burning. He was standing at the window when she entered. He waited until the door was closed before he turned. Up close, he was more and less terrifying than distance had suggested. More, because the scar along his jaw was visible in the way that old scars are. Not grotesque, but honest. A record of something that had cost him. Less, because he looked tired. not the performance of weariness, the real kind, the kind that lives in the set of someone's shoulders and doesn't ease even when they're still. "Tell me what you do," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, and rougher. "I walk to the well," she said. "I draw water, and I walk back. He follows me. You don't call him. No, you don't feed him. You don't speak to him. I spoke to him once," she admitted. "The first morning. I told him my name." Something moved in his expression. "What did you say exactly?" "I said, 'My name is Wren, and I'm not afraid of you.'" A pause. That was mostly a lie, but I said it anyway. He turned back to the window. Outside, the training ground was visible, and beyond it, the wolf's enclosure, a vast walled space of stunted trees and packed earth that had been built to something scale other than human. The wolf was in it now. She could see the movement of it between the bare branches. "He has not chosen a companion since my grandmother's time," Halvard said to the window. "I was told it was because no one worthy had come to court." A pause so long she thought he was done. "I believe now that it was because no one had been stupid enough to look at him directly and tell him they were not afraid." It surprised a breath of a laugh out of her. She was immediately mortified. He turned and looked at her, and something at the corner of his mouth did something almost involuntary. "I am going to assign you to his care," he said. "Formally, you'll have a room in the east wing adjacent to the enclosure. Your other duties will be redistributed. You will report directly to me." "I am an Omega," she said. Not as a complaint, as a statement of practical fact, the kind of thing that mattered in a court like this one. "Yes," he said, "I am aware. The court will not accept it." "The court," he said, in a tone that closed the subject entirely, "does not vote on this." She moved to the east wing that afternoon. The room was small and simply furnished, and the window looked directly into the enclosure. The wolf came to stand below the window within an hour of her arriving, and simply stood there, looking up, until she leaned on the sill and looked back. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll figure this out." His name, she learned from Bren's archives, was Fenrath. Not the wolf's name. The wolf had no separate name, being the same soul expressed differently. Fenrath was a word in the old northern tongue that meant the part that runs ahead. She thought that was about right. She began keeping a record of his patterns, because she kept records of everything as a matter of habit. When he was still, when he moved, what sounds made his ears go flat, and what sounds made him alert in the other way, the interested way. She drew water from the east well every morning, and left a bowl of it inside the enclosure gate, not because she thought it would help, but because it was something to do, and something was always better than nothing. She was not supposed to go inside the enclosure. Halvard had been explicit on this. She followed the rule for 11 days. On the 12th day, she found the wolf lying at the interior of the gate with his head pressed against the bars, and something in the set of him, the weight of it, the particular exhaustion that had nothing to do with the body, made her put her hand on the latch. She went in. He was on his feet before the gate finished swinging, not attacking, not threatening, just present. He enormous and immediately there, close enough that she could see the individual hairs of his fur, each one tipped with that silvery frost. She stood still. He walked around her once, a complete circuit, his shoulder brushing her arm. Then he lay back down, this time with his head near her feet. She sat on the ground beside him for an hour and a half, and watched the cloud cover move across the winter sky. She mentioned it to Halvard that evening, when he stopped by the east corridor to ask his single daily question, which was always, "How is he?" She had come to understand that the question was not only about the wolf. "I went inside the enclosure," she said. "He was still for a moment. I told you not to. I know. He could have killed you. He didn't." Another moment of stillness. He looked at her in the way he had been increasingly looking at her over the past 2 weeks, the way she had caught him looking at the wolf sometimes. as if there was a thing happening that he couldn't fully account for and wasn't yet ready to name. "Don't do it again without telling me first," he said. "Would you have let me go if I'd asked?" He didn't answer that. He looked at the window, at the enclosure beyond, where the wolf was a grey shape visible between the trees. "He hasn't slept a full night in 3 years," he said finally, "since the campaign." Another pause. Longer. "Neither have I." She understood then that Halvard was not just describing the wolf. She was not a healer. She had no magic in her blood, no power, no special gift beyond stubbornness and a good memory for numbers. She was an Omega from a village so small that the seasonal labor allocator had barely been able to find it on the map. But she understood, with a practical clarity that she applied to all problems, that the wolf was not suffering from anything as simple as a curse or a wound. He was suffering from the same thing she had spent 23 years learning to carry: the weight of being seen through, of existing in a space built for other people's comfort, where you were required to be large and powerful and useful, and were never once asked what you needed. She began talking to him, in the enclosure, with her back against the bare bark of one of the stunted trees. She talked the way she might talk to herself when she was doing accounts in the dark, a low, continuous sound, with no performance in it. She told him about the village, about her grandmother's dogs, about the particular smell of the ink she preferred, and why the cheap kind left her wrist stained for 3 days. She told him about the record she was keeping of his patterns, and what she had observed. She told him she thought the court was afraid of him, not because he was dangerous, but because he was real in a way that most of them were not, and real things make people who are mostly performance feel exposed. He listened. His ears turned toward her and stayed there. Sometimes his tail moved. The first time his tail moved, she did not say anything about it. She looked at the sky and kept talking, but she noted it in her record. The crisis came in the 6th week, from the direction she had known it would come from eventually, because Bren had warned her, and because she had been paying attention. Well, Lady Sephra had not forgotten the corridor. She had simply been patient. The charge was formal. An Omega had taken unauthorized occupation of the East Wing, had entered the King's restricted enclosure without sanction, and had been observed engaging in behavior consistent with the use of low charm or dark influence upon the King's bonded wolf. The petition went to the council before dawn, timed so that it would be discussed at the morning session before Halvard had finished his military briefing. Wren found out about it from Bren, who sent a boy to her room before the castle was properly awake. She dressed and went to the council chamber herself. She did not have the right to enter the council chamber. She was an Omega. But she opened the door and walked in and stood at the far end of the long table and waited for the 11 men and women seated along it to stop talking. Sephra was among them. Her expression on seeing Wren enter went through several stages very quickly and ended at something cold. "This is not a chamber open to—" one of the lords began. "I know," Wren said. "I have come because the petition before this council includes false statements, and I would like to correct them before a decision is made on their basis." She set the ledger on the table. "I have kept a record since my first morning in the East Wing. Every entry, every behavior I observed in the wolf, every interaction, every instance in which I entered the enclosure, including the first unauthorized entry, or which I reported to the Alpha King within the hour it occurred." She opened the ledger to the first page. "If anyone on this council is interested in evidence rather than petition, it is here." No one spoke for a moment. "You cannot address this council," Sephra said. "I am addressing it," Wren said. "You may disregard me when I am finished." The door behind her opened. She had not heard him coming. She never did. But she felt the change in the room, the way 11 people who held significant power all adjusted their posture simultaneously. She turned. Halvard stood in the doorway. He had clearly come directly from the military briefing. He still had the maps under one arm. He looked at the council. He looked at Sephra. His gaze moved to the ledger open on the table. Then he looked at Wren, and the expression on his face was the same one he'd had in the corridor 3 weeks earlier when the wolf had pressed its head against her shoulder. She still couldn't fully name it, but she was getting closer. "The petition is withdrawn," he said. He was not speaking to Wren. He was speaking to the council, in the voice that did not leave room for the question of whether it was a suggestion. "My lord," Sephra began, "the matter of the Omegas unauthorized." "Withdrawn," he said again. He looked at Sephra with the particular quality of attention that Wren imagined had preceded most of the significant military outcomes of his reign. "We will discuss your use of council time to settle personal grievances later." He left. The room remained very still. Wren picked up her ledger. She walked back to the east wing. She was shaking slightly, and not from fear now, but from something that felt like adrenaline mixed with a grief she couldn't locate the source of. Or perhaps she could. He had defended her. He had walked into that room and withdrawn the petition with a single word, and looked at her with that expression, and left. And she had been invisible for so long that being defended felt like a foreign country she didn't know how to stand in. She went to the enclosure. She sat against her tree. The wolf came and lay beside her with his flank warm against her leg, and she put her hand in his fur and did not talk, just breathed. That was when she noticed Halvard on the far side of the enclosure, standing inside the gate he'd let himself in through in silence, watching them both. He stood with his hands at his sides, till he looked like a man standing outside a lighted window in the cold, watching something he had not let himself want in a very long time. She said nothing. She did not look away. She held his gaze across the width of the enclosure, and the wolf's tail moved against the frozen ground. Once, twice, a slow, deliberate thump, and she watched Halvard's throat move as he swallowed. "How long has he been doing that?" Halvard said. His voice was different from his council voice, stripped of the command register, just a man asking a question. "Since the 3rd week," she said. He crossed the enclosure slowly and sat on the ground on the other side of the wolf, not beside her, on the wolf's far side, so that Fenrath was between them. He set the maps down on the frozen earth. He put his hand on the wolf's side, and the wolf's breathing deepened, and some of the tension in Halvard's shoulders became visible in its absence. "He does this," he said, "to no one in particular, and it's as if something in my chest loosens." "Because he's you," Wren said quietly. He looked at her across the wolf's back. The grey-silver eyes held hers, and for a long moment the enclosure was very still, the bare trees and the winter light, and the sound of the wolf breathing between them. "Yes," he said, "he is." He came to the enclosure every evening after that. Sometimes he said nothing. Sometimes he asked her about the entries in her ledger, about the specific observations she'd made, and listened with the focused attention of someone who has been given a report on a subject he cares about enormously and has never had reliable intelligence on before. Once he told her about the campaign, not the strategy of it, but one evening in the north, in a ruined hall, when he had let the wolf out and not been able to call it back. 3 days. He had spent 3 days following the wolf through the northern wilderness, trying to find a way back in. He spoke about it the way people speak about things they have not spoken about before, testing the words, uncertain of the weight they would carry. She listened. She did not try to fix it. She had learned that some things do not want to be fixed, only witnessed. The tail had begun wagging with regularity by the 7th week. Not the slow, rare movement of the earliest days, but the unguarded, unrehearsed motion of an animal that has remembered something fundamental about what it is. The first time Halvard saw it happen freely, now without her pointing it out, the wolf beside Wren at the enclosure gate, tail moving with an ease that had no performance in it, he stopped walking. She saw his face. She had grown good at reading it by then, had learned that the stillness he wore in court was not coldness, but management, a containing structure built over something that was very much alive and did not always agree to stay still. She watched the structure drop, just for a moment. She watched what was underneath it. He knelt in the frozen dirt of the enclosure, without any apparent plan to have done so. The wolf turned and pressed its head against his chest, and Halvard's arms came around it, and he held the animal the way you hold something you had come close to losing. His eyes were closed. His jaw was tight. She stood very still. She felt, and with a precision that startled her, that she was watching a 300-year wound breathe for the first time. After a long moment he opened his eyes. He found her where she was standing, and he did not look away. "Wren," he said. That was all. Just her name, one syllable, small as a bird. But he said it the way you say a word you've been turning over for weeks, that has finally resolved itself into a meaning you can hold. She felt it move through her like warm water. "I know," she said. His mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but the honest shape of what a smile starts as before it's decided whether to become one. He stood. He crossed the enclosure to where she was, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he had been almost looking at her for 7 weeks, except this time he let himself do it completely. "I have been king for a long time," he said. "I have ruled this court and its council and its endless political mechanics for longer than most records go back. I have been managed and feared and deferred to in precisely equal measure for 3 centuries. A pause. "No one has walked into my council chamber with a ledger of evidence before." "It seemed like the practical thing," she said. "It was the bravest thing," he said. "And you did it for him, not for yourself." She didn't answer. He was right, but she hadn't thought of it as bravery. She'd thought of it as the only available option that wasn't running. "I would ask you to stay," he said. "Not in the East Wing, at court, with a rank that reflects what you are to him and what you have become to me. I would ask you." A pause, and his voice dropped. "But I am aware that I have a long history of this court being a place that gives people very little actual choice. I would like this to be a choice. If you want to leave, I will provide you with an escort home and a letter that ensures you are never allocated away from your village again." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the village, the elders' accounts, the palate she had never quite been warm on, the 23 years of being useful and invisible. She looked at the wolf, who was watching them both with his pale eyes. "I don't know how to be visible," she said honestly. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been." "I don't know how to let anything in," he said. "We are apparently in similar difficulty." The wolf's tail thumped against the ground. They both looked at it. "He has opinions," Wren said. "He always has," Halvard said. "I just couldn't hear them." She thought about the ledger. She thought about the tree she had made her own in the enclosure, the particular quality of the light in the East Wing in the mornings. She thought about the feeling of being looked at and not looked through, which she had been carrying for 7 weeks, like a thing she was still not sure was real. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, something deeper than the war chamber and the council and the 300 years of managed authority. He reached out and took her hand, both hands around hers, the way you hold something you want to be careful with. "Stay," he said. "Not because the wolf chose you, so because I am choosing you." She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding since the first morning in the courtyard, when she'd picked up her buckets and looked at the wolf and not run. "All right," she said. As for Sephra, there was no dramatic fall from power, no public humiliation, no execution at dawn. Halvard brought the matter before the council 3 days later, clearly and without particular heat. Sephra had used the council's formal processes to pursue a personal grievance against a member of the court's household. The consequences were proportional. She would recuse herself from 3 months of council participation, and her petition would be formally struck from the record. It was neither mercy nor brutality. It was the same ledger logic Wren had walked into the chamber with. Evidence, measured, applied evenly. But Sephra accepted it. She did not look at Wren when she left the chamber. Wren didn't need her to. The months that followed were not simple. A court 3 centuries old does not restructure its understanding of rank and worth in a season. There were council members who remained skeptical. There were ranked she-wolves who did not know how to look at her. There were days when Wren sat in the East Wing and understood with total clarity that she was a woman from a small village with ink-stained wrists and no ancestry worth documenting, and the gap between that and what she had been asked to step into was very wide indeed. But she had her ledger. She had her records. She had the specific, patient skill of watching things closely and writing down what she saw. And she applied that skill to the court the same way she had applied it to the wolf, not trying to force it, just staying present, just doing the work that was in front of her. Halvard, for his part, turned out to be someone who was much easier to be with in private than his court presence suggested. The management he wore in council chambers fell off in the evenings. He had opinions about the state of the kingdom's northern roads. He had a complicated relationship with the council's eldest member that was equal parts respect and exasperation. He slept better. He told her this matter-of-factly, as a report, the way she told him observations from the ledger, without flourish, just data. She had come to understand that this was his version of intimacy, offering information that cost him something. And the wolf slept through most nights by the 2nd month. By the 3rd, he had stopped waking entirely. It was a small thing. It was the entire thing. On a morning in deep winter, with the frost on the enclosure's bare branches, and the pale early light turning everything silver, Wren sat against her tree, with her ledger open on her knee, and watched Halvard crouch in front of the wolf on the frozen ground, the two of them looking at each other, the way they had been learning to look at each other for months now, as the same thing, recognized finally, after a very long time of not knowing what they were looking at. The wolf's tail moved in its slow, steady rhythm against the frozen earth. She wrote it in the ledger, not as an unusual event, as an ordinary morning. That was the difference. That was the whole story. The tail had wagged for the first time in 300 years on a winter morning, when an omega with ink-stained wrists and split boot heels had walked to a well and not run. And it wagged now every morning, unhurried and unremarkable, because the things that had been impossible had been patiently made ordinary, 1 bowl of water and 1 hour of sitting, and 1 ledger entry at a time. She was still an omega. The court still did not entirely know what to do with her. She still had ink on her wrist most mornings, and her boots still let the cold in through the left heel, and she had not yet found a way to walk into a room full of ranked courtiers and feel like she belonged there. But she walked into the enclosure every morning, and the wolf came to her, and the king came in the evenings, and they sat together in the cold winter light, and the 3 of them, and no one looked through anyone. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.